Good evening. Welcome to Zion's Banner. We're going to try to do a live broadcast this evening, which is a little different than what I'm used to. I have done a few of these. We're going to work on doing that. It's good to be back in Arizona. Now, this weekend I'll be speaking at another location in Arizona, but I will at least be in town. So I'm hoping that everybody can hear me okay. And we're going to try to do a live broadcast. And so it seems like everything's coming through okay. It's a little after Yom Kippur, but I still think that this is absolutely worthwhile and was able to have a great conversation during the Day of Atonement. And so we're going to actually deal with Leviticus 17:11. And so it promises to be pretty good. We're going to hear Rabbi Singer's attack on the understanding that Leviticus 17:11 refers to blood atonement and that blood atonement is necessary, which he is going to go ahead and claim is a mere Christian interpretation, and that Christians really don't know their Bible. What we're going to see is that, again, Dr. Singer seems to be a little unaware of his own sources, much less the Bible. So I'm going to go ahead and put this up. I may need a little sound check when I do. I'm going to let it run a pretty good deal, but Rabbi Singer can be a little long-winded. I'm also using the latest download or version of OBS, so I'm still getting a little used to that, but we'll get used to it together. So let me go to the detractors corner here, and trust that when I do this, it will go back to the beginning, because I don't necessarily have a real great control over where this ends up going. So I'm still kind of learning my way around it. But it should go back to the beginning. I'm going to check the stuff on this and put it on a loop so that it does actually start where it starts. And then I'll just be careful to take it off at the right time. You will notice the detraction thing. For those who come in late, these are not the views of the reviewer who will be doing the apologetics. This is an attempt to be intellectually honest and proper and also respectful as much as is possible, because really some things, dumbness, you do have to kind of point out. So this is an attempt to be respectful in listening to another's opinions. So I'm going to go ahead and switch to that now.
Saying that sacrifices are meaningless, how come this is saying that?
Brilliant question. Thank you so much for sharing.
All right, thanks. We'll go ahead and hang up, and we'll just tune in for your answer. Here we go.
So Luke's asking a very interesting question. Tractate Yuma, a tractate in the Talmud dedicated to Yom Kippur. We find that, in fact, without the proper sprinkling of the blood, there's no atonement. So the question he's asking is, how does that work out? We find in the Jewish scriptures, as I mentioned, in Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, in Micah chapter 6, verse 6 through 8, in Jeremiah chapter 7. When you went out of Egypt, when did I talk to you about sacrifice and offerings? Not only that, King David of blessed memory in Psalm chapter 40, verse 6 and 7, with 7 and 8 in the Christian Bible, says, sacrifice and offerings you do not desire. Was Nayim Karisali, but my ears you have opened. Now, King David had good reason to say that, because after all, Hashem forgave his sin, and he didn't bring any sacrifices at all. What is the Talmud referring to? What is the context of the Talmud? If you quote a passage, my guess is that you weren't just studying the Talmud and happened to fall on these passages, but they're on some website. People who actually study the Talmud would never have this question. Nothing wrong, nothing personal. But as it turns out, the context is determinative. The Talmud is not saying that for all sins you must have blood, and blood is the only method of atonement, and without the shedding of blood there is no atonement. The Talmud is addressing a completely different issue in context. when a blood offering is used, is prescribed, for example, in Leviticus chapter 4, 5 and 6, or most germane to Tractate Yuma, Leviticus chapter 16, the offerings that were brought on Yom Kippur. The question is, what happens if the offering was not properly carried out, if an error was made in the sacrifice? Because as it turns out, the Korban Chatos, the sin offering, that's a sin that was committed for a sin committed unintentionally. For instance, the Kohanim, the priests, had to bring that on Yom Kippur. It's the first sacrifices that are mentioned in Leviticus 16. But invariably, during the course of a year, priests who were charged with maintaining the sanctity and sterility of the Temple Mount, so invariably they made mistakes. People were allowed onto the Temple Mount who weren't pure, so they had to bring a Korban Chatos. This was not an offering for intentional sins. But the key is the following. When you bring a sin offering, a Korban Chatos, an example, or Leviticus 16:16, this is a special offering of the goat specifically to atone for the sanctuary. It literally says, to atone for the sanctuary. That's how it opens. That means for those people who committed the sin of bringing an offering during the year in a state of impurity, either intentionally or unintentionally. Very unique. I don't want to go off track. I want to stay focused. If you ask me why later, I'll explain why that would work. It's brilliant, but I can't go into it now. Let's stay focused. So now you have to bring the Korban Chatos or Korban Oshim. So the question is, what happens? The Talmud is addressing what happens if it's not done properly, if you didn't follow all the procedures properly. So as it turns out, there were many parts of the ritual of bring a offering to Hashem. The Talmud is then saying the part which, if there is any mistake made or not done properly or not done at all, the whole offering is worthless and you have to bring another one. It's not kosher, it's not acceptable. What is the part of the offering that must be done perfectly, without mistake? That's what's called the avodas hadam. The avodas hadam means that the part of slaughtering the animal has to be done properly, the collecting of the blood has to be done properly, the carrying of the blood to the altar has to be done properly, and the sprinkling of the blood in the altar has to be done properly. And if any mistake was made during those procedures, the whole offering was canceled completely. Now, why? I'll do a 60-second version of that. We can eat meat of an animal that's slaughtered properly. If it's kosher, we make a bracha, you didn't steal the food, and it won't affect our neshama. However, listen carefully, we cannot process the blood. Can't process blood. Only an altar could do that. And that's why if you look at Leviticus 17:11, it says, on the altar, and Jesus didn't die on any altar. But I just want to explain what's going on. We can't process blood. There's no way that we can drink blood, that we can go unaffected by that event. That's why this is one of the commandments given to the children of Noah. See Genesis chapter 9, where they're warned when the children of Noah are told that they can eat meat, but make sure that there's no blood in the flesh. That you can't do. Your body cannot, your soul cannot process blood. It can't and will damage you. You have to have a context. The context is, if you're bringing a sacrifice, it is the blood which affects the atonement. It doesn't mean that without the shedding of blood, there's no atonement. That's Hebrews. There's nothing like that in the Jewish scriptures. Now, of course, Hebrews 9:22 misquotes Leviticus 17:11, of course. And people who read Leviticus 17, who are look, I'm going to say it, I hope I don't offend. I don't want to offend. But Christians don't read Leviticus 17:11 in context. And if you're not sure, you could believe me that Christians are running to the Bibles now to look it up. And it's a shame. Because if a verse is verse 11 in Leviticus 17, what happened to verse 10? What is it talking about there? The context has nothing to do with atonement. The context of Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11 is eating blood, namely its prohibition. Go back to Leviticus chapter 17, verse 10, where we're introduced to the prohibition that a person is not allowed to eat blood. The only thing you could do with blood is you can put it on the altar to make an atonement when that's the prescribed offering. So the text is not saying that without the shedding of blood there's no atonement. Now, yes, of course, if you take a text in the Talmud and you rip it out of context, well, of course you would think that. That means if you strip the context away, you're in huge trouble. I cover this extensively in Volume 1 of Let's Get Biblical. The context is that when the prescription for sin is an offering, and there are many such sacrifices, there's a carbon oiler, which is a voluntary sacrifice offering for sin. So in that context, when you bring the carbon chatos, the sin offering, the carbon osham, the guilt offering, difference, the guilt offering is brought by someone who recognized they sinned, they were not caught sinning, and they voluntarily come forward and say, I did a mistake, so that person's able to bring an offering. A thief was caught, there's no offering, he just pays it double. In the context of the Yom Kippur sacrifice, Leviticus 16, if other elements, let's say the smicha, I'm not going to go into all the Jewish law offerings, other parts of the offering are not performed properly, the offering still is efficacious. However, when it comes to avodas hadam, which all leads up to the sprinkling of blood on the altar, if that is not done properly, with the proper kavanah, with the proper intent, so in the sacrifice, there's no atonement. It doesn't work if the avodas hadam, which means the I have to translate that in my head, that aspect of the offering which pertains to the blood is not brought properly. It doesn't say there that you could bring sacrifice for all kinds of sin without the shedding of blood. There's no offering. There's no atonement, as it says in Hebrews 9:22. So you have to.
So as I was saying, he doesn't really know the fact that you have Kaporath and you have Orthodox Jews swinging a chicken, and that whole thing indicates that's not accurate. You can let me know. The mic should be on now. We're live here, and so I brought everything back up to its normal level, and everything's showing. There's just a few second delay. We're going to move on and start dealing with some of this and that whole thing. So let's get a start on this now and start working through this. I'm going to drop this because we're really through with Rabbi Singer, and it's time to evaluate this constant claim. This is so much what Jewish polemicists do. They make out like Christians don't know the context of their Bible. They don't read it correctly, and no one that disagrees with them reads anything correctly. And we're going to even look at this Talmud passage, okay? So let's look at red herrings and straw man arguments here. Now, he's going to misrepresent the prophets. And I quoted Dr. Michael Brown here. We have to see a difference between the prophets teaching that prayer and worship could be accepted by God in addition to offerings. See, nowhere do you see that there's an instead of in the verse he showed. We're going to look at that verse. But does the verse really say instead of? Or for the sake of? As a replacement? He is kind of throwing stuff here. Okay, and Dr. Michael Brown is right to point this out. We're going to deal with it more later. They taught that, yes, there were things acceptable to God in addition to the sacrificial system, but they weren't necessarily saying that they were acceptable instead of the sacrificial system. So that's an assertion that he makes that isn't necessarily supported by the text, and we're going to take a look at it. Let's look at the Micah passage together. Now, I've stuck that up there so that you'll be able to see that in a few minutes. And we'll talk about the background of Micah. And by the way, he's so big on context, and we're going to deal with context a little bit because his idea of context is not context. His idea of context is to try and negate the authorial meaning of the passage by cherry picking. He's very, very good at cherry picking. And you know what? It's nice that he doesn't want to offend, but the reality is, okay, I don't want to offend either. You're cherry picking. You're picking out parts of things without paying attention to the whole because they support your case. So let's look at the context here. Now, the context is that God is very unhappy with Israel. And so, hear you mountains, the controversy of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth, for the Lord has controversy with his people, and he will contend with Israel. And so the context of this is really God having a problem with Israel's covenant breaking. It is not God having a problem with the sacrificial system. It is God having a problem with their covenant breaking. And by the way, yes, the prophets do speak about the right kavanah. By the way, that's the word intention. Okay, he used it several times, and right kavanah is not a wrong thing. It is an important thing. But the problem that we face is he's extending the argument too far. So the context is Micah is having a problem with the children of Israel's covenant breaking. And by the way, part of that covenant breaking in the context is Israel doing certain rituals, but doing them without the right heart attitude. Let's look at Michael Brown's analysis, which is really excellent on 2 points. First of all, does anyone think that Mike is repudiating these divinely ordained sacrifices? Folks, if the sacrificial system didn't matter so much, why did God go and give such instructions that were so detailed about a tabernacle that really was simply procedural and made a nice tent? Okay, the entire book of Leviticus is a manual for the priests. The first 5 chapters deal with the sacrificial system. Yes, there are 1 or 2 sacrifices that we can talk about, objections that don't require blood, but the reality is how much blood and how much information do we have about the sacrificial system? And if blood atonement was really unnecessary, would we really need all that information? The other thing, ironically, which I really like pointed out, and Michael Brown was brilliant in pointing this out, is that anti-missionaries like Singer often argue that Jesus was not a true prophet because they claim he ignored or violated Torah and led others to do so. And he says he led others to ignore or violate Torah. He mentions his 3rd volume, Objection 528. Yet if this passage from Micah means what anti-missionaries claim, like Singer, then Micah was a false prophet too. In fact, he would have been considered a false prophet at the worst kind, since it is alleged that he aggressively spoke against the sacrifice and offerings. Obviously, this cannot be the case. Now, what is he saying here? He's saying, look, If, as Singer argues, it's the Torah and the prophets can't violate or argue against the Torah, then if Micah is saying something against the sacrificial system, he's saying something against the Torah, and he's obviously a false prophet. Now remember that Singer's made that claim in other videos, that a prophet can't say anything beyond what Torah says. Not only that, but Rabbi Asher Metza says exactly the same thing. So how could Micah be repudiating the sacrificial system and be a true prophet? Singer's own arguments don't work with that sort of situation, much less anything else. Now, he talks about context. Context does not mean you look at the verse above and the verse below and you don't look at the greater context at all. This is actually horrible use of context. The context would include, of course, the verse above and below, and then you would look at the chapter or where the Hebrew text breaks and the next pericope occurs. So let's do that. Let's look a little closer to the beginning of Leviticus 17 and see what we're talking about here, okay? We're talking about if they kill an animal, what the procedure is. And so it says that essentially the previous verse says that if he kills an animal to eat it and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, he will be held guilty of bloodshed, for he shed blood and he shall be cut off from the people. This is in order that the people of Israel may bring their sacrifices that they offer in an open field, that they may bring them to the Lord, to the priest, at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and offer them as sacrifices of well-being to the Lord. And the priest will dash the blood, what are we talking about here? Blood, against the altar of the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and turn the fat into smoke as a pleasing odor to the Lord. Now, are we talking about dietary laws here? We're not talking about dietary laws here. We are talking about food, but the blood needs to be accounted for and given back to the Lord. And by the way, this isn't a problem with the dietary, what your soul can process. I found that a little weird, that my soul can't process blood. My soul doesn't process my food, my body does. And he deliberately used the term neshama instead of nephesh. Neshama usually refers to the consciousness or the soul directly, and so what he's essentially saying is that this material is here because our souls can't properly digest blood. Well, since when do my soul digest anything? My body digests. But furthermore, the priest will dash the blood against the altar and he will burn the smoke as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Is this a dietary law about processing blood? This is about the fact that the blood must be presented to God. Now, we'll talk about the reason here, okay? But the greater context deals with offering in the tent of meeting over and above the kosher laws, because you have the kosher law and the eating. But before you have the eating, you have the blood has to be given back to God at the tent of meeting as an offering. So we clearly have sacrifice and offering and atonement. And so, the greater context is not merely giving a kosher law. The greater context goes back to the tent of meeting and the need to offer blood back to God. Okay? But he also ignores this very important principle. The context of a verse includes the reason for the verse. If a verse is given and it states a particular reason for something, the reason for that something is part of the context. It's not separated from it. So I put the Hebrew up here, and I'm going to make sure it's a little small for me to read. Ve'ani nitan taiv lechem al. It should be the word for altar. Chametz beach li chafar al nefesh teichem. Okay? And so the reason is included as part of the context. The reason that kosher law is given that you can't eat blood is because blood has a very specific purpose to it. It has a unique purpose to it, and so you're not allowed to eat it. All right? Now, how do I know that? Jeff, you would say you're making things up. You're being such a Christian. Okay, you don't know your Bible. I dare say that the average Christian scholar is far more aware, particularly the average Christian scholar in Old Testament scholarship, is far more aware of the Hebrew meaning, the text of the meaning of the Hebrew text, than Rabbi Singer is. So let's see how Rabbi Singer fails to understand Hebrew grammar and some of the reasons. Why do I know that Leviticus 17 is not just about the kosher laws? Well, the greater context tells me that, with the tent of meeting and the need to sprinkle the blood and burn the fat of any animal that I kill out in the field, offering it back to the Lord. But beyond that, it says that God has given it to you. And the root of that is Natan, or Nathan, is the English name that we get from that. Okay? And God says he's given them blood for a specific purpose. So it doesn't say anything about soul food and whether my soul can digest blood at all. It says that God has particularly given blood to the children of Israel for a purpose. Okay, and someone's getting into the reasons a little more about as far as blood guilt and life. The life of the flesh is in the blood. God is the author of life. There's some other things there too, with life conquering death. The wages of sin is death. The soul that sins, it shall die. Ezekiel 18:33. What counters death but life? The important thing to know is, if this was just about kosher laws and what your soul could digest, God wouldn't say he's given blood and then list a purpose. He'd say you can't eat blood, and that's all there is to it. By the way, the word Natan can also mean set or appointed, which can mean that God set blood up for a specific purpose, or he appointed it for the children of Israel for a specific purpose. Now, what you're seeing there is out of Logos. You'll see the main reasons. Given and give are really the same sort of idea, okay? But you'll also see put or putting as a meaning, and you'll also see set or setting as a meaning, or delivered. God delivered blood for a certain purpose. It has the idea of transferring something. Blood, the life that is represented by the blood, was God's. God transferred the ability to use that blood in a certain way for a very specific purpose. Now, he mentions the Noah laws. What he ignores is that Noah was sacrificing to God for the sake of atonement before Sinai. Okay? He also ignores basic Hebrew grammar. It's amazing to me how a rabbi who's going to talk about Torah can ignore Hebrew grammar. Lechafar is and it's not dotted. I would say kafar, but it's not dotted there. And so it doesn't have the hardening dot. Is an infinitive construct. There are two types of infinitives in Hebrew, an infinitive construct and an infinitive absolute. So you're going to get a little Hebrew grammar tonight. This verse is giving the divine reason for the kosher law against eating blood. And the reason is that blood has a unique purpose. It's provided for atonement. Now, I ended up quoting a basic Hebrew grammar here on page 122. The infinitive construct is used to express purpose or to give further reason or clarification to the other verb. So God has given it, and then further clarification comes for a specific purpose for atonement. So the context, the greater context, is about sacrifice and the tent of meeting, not what my soul can digest. And by the way, it's not merely procedural. We're talking about any time you kill an animal, you are responsible to bring it. So we're not talking about different types of sacrifices in general. We're talking in general, blood has to be given back to God. Why? For the same reason you can't eat it. Why? Because blood is given for atonement. And so there's a specific reason here, and he's ignoring the grammar and he's ignoring the greater context, which requires you to give the blood back to God and the fat back to God in terms of an offering of any animal you get. Okay? Let's get a little further here. The mention of a kosher law connected with the injunction that blood makes atonement doesn't change the clear principle or statement of Torah that it is blood that does indeed give atonement. Okay? Professor Richard Avebeck, an Old Testament scholar who is also an expert in Sumatran literature, explains the significance of Leviticus 17:11. And by the way, this is a scholar. I'm sorry, Rabbi. Avebeck is quite conversant in Hebrew literature and Hebrew. Blood atonement is mentioned in Leviticus 17:11. Now watch this, as the rationale for draining the blood from a domestic animal before eating the meat. The point is not that blood atones for the killing of the animal contra, but instead, if one is going to utilize the blood for anything, it has only one proper use. That is to make atonement on the altar of the Lord. Now see what's happening here? The reason for the kosher law is that blood has a specific reason, not that my soul will get indigestion. So in the context, which is about sacrifice and the need to go ahead and give back to God the life of that animal, since God's the originator of that animal, blood is strictly for atonement. So the greater context supports the idea that blood is for atonement. The infinitive construct supports the idea that blood is for atonement. The use of the verb natan as if God gave blood for a specific purpose supports that it's for atonement. Apparently, he's ignoring context more than he's using context. But let's go further. Now, I really like this. He is in contrast to Jewish thought. You really should read some of his own sources. I have Rabbi Hertz's commentary on the Pentateuch. I quoted it by Dr. Michael Brown because I can't lay hands on my copy right now. I really received that at my bar mitzvah, interestingly enough. And in the bottom line of that entire Pentateuch, there's a bottom section with commentary. Rabbi J.H. Hertz was the late chief rabbi of England. So we're not talking about some Christian source. We're not talking about some not knowing source. We're talking about the chief rabbi of London. Okay? You think he might know what Torah says about this? Watch this. This is him commenting on Leviticus 17:11. You know that verse that Christians get wrong? Watch what he says. The use of blood representing life and the rites of atonement symbolized the complete yielding up of the worshiper's life to God and conveyed the thought that surrender of a man to the will of God carried with it the assurance of divine pardon. What is he saying here? Blood is to be used representing life in the rites of what? Avoiding indigestion for my soul? In the rites of atonement. In other words, what Rabbi Hertz is saying is blood is clearly associated as being necessary and part of the rites of atonement. This is the late chief rabbi of London. Seriously? This is a Jewish source. Now, again, I could have quoted the exact page. You'll find it in the Pentateuch and Haftorahs, page 487 at the bottom. Michael Brown is simply quoting a Jewish source. So it's absolutely crazy. Not only is this contrary to the grammar, the overall greater context of the passage, the use of but it's even contrary to Jewish sources. Okay? Let's go further here. Isidore Singer's The Jewish Encyclopedia. You know, if he just spent time with the Jewish Encyclopedia, he'd be doing so much better. The cessation of sacrifice in consequence to the destruction of the temple came therefore as a shock to the people. Why? Because it deprived them of divine atonement. It seemed to. Well, actually, it seemed to for a very good reason. Okay? So everybody in Jesus' day understood that the temple and this temple sacrificial system was necessary for atonement. Okay? Did anyone debate this in Jesus' day? By the way, he keeps harping on Hebrews. Hebrews is not misquoting anything. This was the understanding of Jews in the Second Temple period. This is not a misquote. When you take the historic understanding of the people, as far as what a verse says, you're not misquoting the verse. Hebrews is reiterating what was clearly understood. It's got to stop that. Hebrews was written to Jewish people by a Jewish author within the understanding of Second Temple Judaism to make the point that Jesus indeed provided something better than the sacrificial system. There would have been no need, if atonement wasn't provided by the temple, to go ahead and write an entire letter stating that Jesus gave a better atonement than the temple, because no one would have been going there for it. So, if anything, the fact that Hebrews quotes this material shows, it just further amplifies what people were thinking. Let's go. Hence, many turned ascetic, abstaining from bread and wine. Tosef, Satah, and then we have Avot Rabbi Dinatan, and Joshua ben Hananiah, who cried out in despair, "Woe unto us, what shall atone for us?" Well, obviously, blood wasn't for atonement, so why does he have such a problem here? Because he understood what every other Jew at the time understood. So this is disingenuous at best. Sorry if my voice squeaks a little. I've been doing a lot of speaking. But let's look at Yoma 5a, which he says is out of context because it's simply provisional. Does laying on of the hand on the sacrifice make atonement? What is the question that's being asked? What makes atonement in the sacrifice? It's procedural, but it's procedural in what respect? It's procedural, asking a question about what makes atonement. In other words, there's a whole procedure to the sacrifice, and so the question is, what part of the sacrifice makes atonement? Okay? Now, again, he's separating the context from the purpose. The purpose is to discern the means of atonement. Okay? As it is said, for blood makes atonement by reason of the life in it. Does the waving of the offering make atonement? It may be procedural, but the question is atonement. If you're going to pay attention to the context, you have to pay attention to the question. What's the question? The fact that it's procedural and there are different types of atonements doesn't change what's being asked. Is it not the blood that makes atonement? What are they doing? This is the way it's translated, Yoma 5a, in the Sanchino Talmud. Okay? He's saying because there are different types of atonement, this is just a procedural question, it doesn't count. Well, it does count, because the question related to the procedure is still the question of which part of the sacrifice makes atonement. That is like arguing that a baseball runner who runs to a base after the guy catches the ball isn't out, because outs and innings and strikes are all simply procedural matters, so they don't count. That's an absurd argument. If the question about the procedure relates to atonement, then indeed it is discussing atonement. That would be contextual. Isn't there another way we could have said this if it was simply a question of minutia procedure? Well, sure. It could have easily said, what could be substituted for blood in making an offering? Again, Rabbi Singer is ignoring the logical truth. The reason is part of the context. And he's deliberately cherry picking. He's pointing out that it's about the procedure, but he's cherry picking by ignoring the question that's on the floor related to that procedure and what its implications are. So I got to have some good conversations during Yom Kippur. And I actually got to visit family. And I'm going to put this up just because we're starting to have some conversations in my family. Here's the thing, Rabbi Singer. What then atones? Well, good works, the death of the individual, the prayers. Really? Look, could any good deed that I do bribe God to accept me regardless of my transgression? That's almost blasphemous. The things that you're replacing for blood, which represents life, are virtually blasphemous in Judaism. You know, it's not the Christians that are doing the blaspheming here. This minimizes God. This is really bad news. Believing that God can accept other means of atonement makes the prayer for the rebuilding of the temple, the Shemona Esrei, which is recited several times a day, a joke. Rabbi Singer, why do they want to see a temple built and continue to pray for it since the temple never provided atonement anyway and blood doesn't need to be shed? What a waste of a building project for us to go ahead and do all that if, after all, there's really no need for it. The very fact that the Shemona Esrei asks that the fire offerings might be made again so that Israel might have a relationship, and I'm thinking about the exact wording, that Israel might again be able to do this service before God, would make no sense if the temple blood atonement was totally unnecessary. So this fails the context test because the greater context still connects back to sacrifices and atonement. It fails the grammar, and it even fails Jewish thought in the Second Temple. Rabbi Singer continually does the same thing. He reads modern Judaism back into Second Temple Judaism. But Hebrews wasn't written for rabbinical Judaism. It was written based on what the thinking was at the time. That's not a misquote. And so he's trying to minimize blood atonement because Judaism today is not the Judaism of the Torah. Nobody after Sinai, when the tabernacle was set up, questioned whether they had to bring sacrifices to the tabernacle and whether blood had to be spilled. Nobody questioned that. Nobody in the Second Temple period questioned that at all. Now, that's being questioned because Judaism does not have a provision for atonement except what the rabbis made up, and so he wants to minimize this issue. Now, admittedly, he thinks he's protecting Judaism, but he's protecting Judaism from God. That's kind of silly to me. Look at what the Torah says, look at the greater context, and also look at the fact that Jewish thinking has always upheld these things. If you end up attacking Jewish thinking of the Second Temple period and before, that's ridiculous. I didn't deal with all the verses he mentioned. None of them get rid of the need for blood atonement. When David says what he says, He says that God isn't requiring an atonement from him at that time. David never said God never required an atonement. David sacrificed. That would have made no sense. Jeremiah is not talking against the sacrificial system. He's discussing the abuse of the sacrificial system, and he's talking about mere ceremonialism, and he's discussing things that should be there with the sacrifice, such as the proper intent. Now, I know that we don't need the sacrificial system anymore, but if you remove blood atonement, then you remove the very basis for Jesus' sacrifice. That's what Hebrews is talking about. Jesus gave a better sacrifice that once and for all forgave sin. He's attacking blood atonement to undermine the foundation. And so that's what's going on here. I don't think he makes a good case that because there's some procedural things that Jewish people believe that blood atonement in the Second Temple period was unnecessary, that David believed it was unnecessary to have a temple for God, that the priests and Levites believed that blood did not need to be spilled for atonement as they were doing those sacrifices, that Leviticus 17 and 11 is just about kosher laws with no reference to atonement being by blood. I don't think he makes a sufficient case for that at all. So, that's kind of where we at. I know that we're probably a little shorter tonight. Little harder to throw together a live broadcast, but we will get better at this. The main thing is that the video actually did work. So I just have to remember to turn those things down just a bit. It's exciting to be back. I don't have anything planned for Thursday. I might do a premiere, but it's just getting back, and then I have to speak. Or what I might do is do what I'm going to be sharing at Sutton. That might be fun. You guys will hear what I'm preaching at Sutton ahead of time. Some great observations here. Yes, it is amazing how much Rabbi Singer wants to undermine and unravel even traditional Jewish thought and even other Jewish sources in terms of ignoring them simply because of his real dislike for Jesus and his real desire to make that a non-issue. And that is why Zion's Banner exists to make, one of the many reasons Zion's Banner exists to make much of Messiah. Thanks for the folks who tuned in. I have Get Vocal now, and I'm going to try to use that live occasionally, particularly when I'm on the road or for special things. It simultaneously broadcasts. I'm not going to advertise them too much because I don't, you know. But that's just a means to simultaneously broadcast when I want to do something live and I'm not in my usual spot. So it is great to have everyone back. Some special people, some folks I hadn't seen for a while have kind of jumped back into the fray. Special thanks. Some of you guys are just such supporters. But one folk who's been here a lot and who I really appreciate, I got close to seeing her because I was near Indiana, actually became a patron. So that is absolutely wonderful. Check it out. I am on Patreon. We are also missionaries with Chosen People. Chosen People would love to see our support go up, but if you want to just support the videos or support us that way, there is the Patreon. Also, as pointed out by Nate, thank you, Nate, hit the like and punch the subscribe. So, that's about it for tonight, unless anything comes up. A few verses here. Yes. Good verses. 2 Samuel 6:18. Excellent. just pointing out that David did believe in the sacrificial system. You'll also note that even though the prophets may have preached when the temple wasn't up, how many prophecies are there about the temple being rebuilt and the Jews returning? Why rebuild a temple if you don't need blood atonement? So all of that is great stuff. Again, we have a few minutes when I end the stream to go ahead and talk and converse. I am so glad to be back with you guys. I'm excited. Some of the videos have done really good. The one about is Christianity polytheism has hit greater numbers. And in the near future, I hope to work with things like end screens and stuff. So that is absolutely wonderful. All in all, why is this important? We know why. Because Jesus' sacrifice was foreshadowed by the blood atonement sacrifices before, and because good works and prayer and all of those things cannot end up bribing a good God to go ahead and accept me, nor does he need my good works. So, really good stuff. Well, we'll keep talking, but I'm going to end up cutting the stream for now. I'm grateful for everyone who liked the video already and those who have seen it. And I'm kind of praying that it gets out and that more folks end up seeing it. Little short but sweet, but a nice live stream for the evening to get things kicked off.